Hello and welcome to another Imperfectly Perfect conversation for the Flourishing Education podcast. Today, I welcome my guest, Dr. Kat. A very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So,
Glad to be here.
yeah, lovely to have you back because obviously we had an episode previously that I will have posted prior to this around me connecting with you because of the amazing book you've written. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
But just in case our listeners have not listened to this particular episode for whatever reason, would you shall we start with who you are, where you are in the world, and a little bit about you and your journey thus far?
Yeah, yeah. So the last podcast that we did is we kind of found each other through the book I wrote on phenomenological dissertations. So I've been doing that with doctoral students is primarily who I teach. So I do that full time. I teach doctoral students primarily in that discipline. Um, but I also have private practice, and so I do a lot of work primarily with men, actually, on sexual addiction, and it's all encompassed within, the mindfulness journey and spiritual journey, and that's really how I'm able to kind of help them and also their partners. Um, Whenever they're having relationship issues. So yeah, like two sort of different areas, I think, but all very connected, in terms of the way that you see the world, right? Like, so phenomenology is all about that too, is like, what is this phenomenon? So in my grounding as a researcher, the big link too, and I'll tell my counseling students that, is that like within qualitative research, because I'm always analyzing like in my mind, so I'm looking at like patterns, that's really translated very well to working with clients. So as they're speaking, and it's not this sort of, you know, just like a venting session, or like let's get it all out and let's look at tools. Like, I'm constantly like sort of looking for patterns, like, how is this familiar, where has this happened before? And then from that starts like that spiritual journey of mindfulness and awakening and all of that. So all really like works very well together. But my sort of analytical qualitative mind is such a huge component of allowing them to have those aha moments, like, oh my gosh, I've been doing the same thing for decades, right? Running from this, running from that in this way. So those can were like how those two things are joined. Um, and one definitely enriches the other, when you think like they're very like separate disciplines, they really are, and they are enhancing, and also like within my counseling, being able to work with students, because a lot of times they get stuck, perfectionistic, all of that kind of thing. Like, you wouldn't be in the doctoral program probably unless you were striving, right? Like a high striver, and a lot of times that will block and get in students' way as well. And so it goes the other direction as well in terms of being able to help them be mindful and help them get unstuck so that they can do the work, that we're don't need to be perfect, but depending on your patterns and how you grew up, a lot of times that can really stick somebody, and they just simply cannot get past themselves. So in both disciplines, like that's been the journey, for 25 years, been doing that, the counseling, and then about 15, 16 years been doing the research. So yeah, it's definitely enhanced it a lot.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I can imagine that the phenomenology is actually that lived experience, and the patterns helps you to get to the essence and like the almost like the what's going on, right, for the person, like you were saying. Is that what you
Yeah, absolutely. Because in order for you to be able to change, you need clarity, right? Like, you need to, and so the most difficult thing to get clarity around is your subjective experience, right? And so to be able to like step out into an observer mode for yourself and being able to look at, what is happening for me. So, for Husserl, right, it's that bracketing out, the setting aside, right? So look at Eckhart Tolle's work, in terms of being the observer. So, he talked a lot about, being in the present moment, but also that there's two selves. So there's the subjective self, he calls the ego, and then there's the observer and sort of like the objective self, for lack of a better word, And so Husserl will call that being able to bracket out your experience. So you're actually moving into the observer role of looking at, what is this thing that this ego, the subjective thing that I'm kind of wrapped up in that I'm not seeing. And so these two selves always exist within us. But the problem is that most people live in the subjective mode, like the ego mode. So you're just constantly like having a feeling and then having a reaction. It's this reactive, I call it like a dissociative state, right? And so a big part of healing and moving in the counseling journey, working with men, women, any really issue. I just happen to work with men primarily, is being able to observe the self, right? And so that's the thing, is like once you have clarity, then you can start to maneuver, and move and shift, right? But you need that first, is that, that clarity. So like Husserl did it way before, he wasn't a counselor or a researcher, but we're really building on those concepts just in terms of, observer versus ego, what Eckhart Tolle talked about. And the observer, the outside of the horizon, which is you can't bracket out, right? The observer, that part of when you're looking at yourself, like, what am I doing? Or, oh, that's interesting. That's actually, for Eckhart Tolle talks about, is your real self, like your authentic self, right? So like your soul always knows. And so it's stepping in and looking at that subjective experience. If you can stay in your observer mode, the more that you can stay there, you can create any life you want, you know? And so that's in essence kind of like whatever you're working on, that's the work, right? That's very different than, you're doing this, let's do this instead. So even like with positive coping mechanisms, they talk about, like, well, I don't want to do this, so I'll do this instead. Okay, well, that sounds great, right? In terms of I'm going to go jogging, So great, you'll have like really great endurance, you'll be very fit, but if what you're doing is still avoiding, right? And so instead of doing this destructive habit, now you're doing something constructive, but you haven't gotten at the essence of, right? Like what's happening for me. You haven't allowed yourself to move through it. So even, positive coping mechanisms, even though they look good, there's still avoidance, right? So you can utilize those things, but if that's your primary part of moving through the world, of avoiding the things um, that you don't want to look at or that feel bad, trauma or whatever it is, right? And instead of doing the destructive habit, now you're doing the constructive habit. The question is have you healed,
Mm. And it
right?
becomes addictive, right? There's loads of people who are
It can. Oh,
addicted
yeah.
to do sports because it releases all those good hormones, right? Like in the same way that some
Yeah.
other addiction does.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a matter of switching, and so, like that's the thing, is like, have you arrived, right? Like, are you moving through? Are you changing? Are you elevating, right? Or, so when you shift to, instead of avoiding, you're moving through things like the palpability of something, right? Like even a trauma in your present moment, that you're able to communicate to your subconscious, like, I can live through this, I can be with this, and then allowing that feeling to move through you. Then you start to elevate, you start to move up, within yourself. And then that doesn't mean life is easy and always happy, but when you have challenges, you can move through those just the same. And those challenges guide you and build you. So they're gifts, right? And then you're able to see, like, why is this here? Like, why is this is happening now in my life? Why is this here? What's the purpose of this? Because everything is seeing the purpose in everything rather than like, oh man, like this is here. Now I have to avoid it, right? They're not things to avoid. They're always, and then the thing is also being able to see, like, okay, well, if I avoid it now, it'll come back. And then what do I do with it next time? So the only choice if is to move through it if you're going to grow and if you're going to elevate, or you're constantly living in that dissociative state. Whether you're jogging or shooting heroin, right? You know what I mean? It's if you're avoiding that same thing, you're chasing your tail rather than moving up the spiral staircase, right? Sometimes things feel familiar, but might be on a different level at that time, right? And that's the work. So that's very different when you can see your life as purposeful, right? That it's not meaningless or random at all, that you create everything. Everything that comes your way is manageable, right? you know because it's purposeful, and I've brought it here. So it's all of that. It's just a different way of like looking at life, right? But that's what, when you think about people moving in dissociative state, like that's really what it is. It's like me avoiding pain, right? Like me avoiding running away constantly. And then we get wrapped up in working too much, or, drinking too much, or jogging too much, or, whatever it is, right? And it's like you're not living, you're not in that present, you're not present in the moment, and so it's about, that's the work I do, is teaching people how to live differently. So when I said I work with men with sexual addictions, is I tell them this journey isn't about getting rid of the addiction, like getting rid of the behaviors. That's a symptom of when you change your life. Those things will simply just not serve you, because you'll have no need to avoid and dissociate. You'll be living differently, and so it's this is you're learning a journey of life that's purposeful, right? Where you get to create your reality, right? And so it's much larger than that. But people come in, right? When I work with them, it's like they're in a hole, trying to get them out of the hole. And then it's like we continue to work together, and then they're working on things that are completely different, but the journey's the same. But it's not, they're no longer doing any destructive behavior, simply because it's not something they want to do anymore. It doesn't serve who they are. They've just simply elevated, and they'll continue to do that. The journeys
Mm.
keeps going till
Yeah,
we till we're out till we're out of here for this life,
it's
right?
amazing. And so, as I heard you sort of talk about the how people get stuck in the ego, right? And
Mhm.
in the moving away from pain, um, by finding, what I call our drug of choice. So my drug of choice was work and
Mhm.
overworking and sugar. Um,
Mhm.
they're the two that are my favorites in the whole sort of like array of choices. Um, and it's so common to see so many of us almost afraid to feel the emotions. And I don't know, I would love your thoughts whether, my PhD is around looking at well-being, and in particular, it's a criticism or a critique of positive psychology, and this invitation to constantly look at the positives and thinking positive thoughts rather than actually being with your emotions. And
Mhm.
the chat some of the more what we call challenging emotions. um so if some of our listeners are in that space and they're able to recognize what their their choice is in that instance of being stuck in the chasing the, or like moving away from the pain, and what sometimes feels like dark thoughts almost.
Mhm.
What um what would you say to them? What would be,
Yeah, so those two things work hand in hand. So the reason why, a lot of times people talk about like, so you talk about positive like affirmations, right? Like, you put a post it, those things are great, but not within themselves, not if you're utilizing them to escape the the feeling that's in front of you, because your subconscious is created to protect you, right? So it's whenever I was, young, I would run to my room to keep myself safe so my father wouldn't hit me, right? But now as I grow up as an adult, right, as a young man or as a young woman, that fleeing in conflict still exists, right? And for the subjective mind, the context doesn't matter, right? So it's a matter of let's keep you safe. This is what we do to protect you, to keep you alive. And so the importance of the positivity is where you're going, right? So this is where I'm moving forward in terms of I will have a great life, I will have a great partnership, I will have a great job, right? So those things are important. But the other pieces that's important is communicating to your subconscious that you can live through whatever pain's in front of you so that you no longer need to avoid. You no longer need to escape from the conflict. And so being able to fully feel and move through that emotion, actually not running with it. So what I mean by that is not like worrying, anxiety, right? Like living the future, like, oh, well, this has happened, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. That's different than moving through it, as opposed to just, it's a visceral thing, right? It's not a cognitive thing. It's just fully feeling the sadness, the anger, whatever pain, whatever's in front of you, and then connecting that to your body, the vessel in which we're in, right? That we experience life, right? And then being able to fully feel that it's kind of like a bell curve is how I explain it to clients, to adult clients. You'll feel it and you'll get increase, 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 and then eventually through one session it'll decrease. You'll kind of ride that wave, and then what you're doing, and then to adolescence, I talk about like a roller coaster ride, kind of like when you're at the peak, and then you bring them back down. Same thing, same concept. But what you're doing in that is not running with emotion. You're not in the past or the future. You're in the present, and you're communicating to your subconscious mind that you can survive this in your present moment. And so when that trigger comes, what by riding that wave all the way through, you're actually moving that feeling and trauma out of your vessel, out of your body. And you can do that a couple times the next time that it comes, or bringing that into your present moment just to do a session like that, if it's something that's like a constant, right? So those two things go hand in hand. But then when you're looking towards moving forward and creating your life, you stay in the positive, because our default is positive emotions, and they hold more energy than negative emotions, which is so cool, right? But if you're constantly thinking negative thoughts, because your mind, as long as it's thinking, it's happy, it doesn't matter what it's thinking, right? But if you stay in the negative of thinking negative thoughts, then you create more negative energy. So those two things work hand in hand, in terms of, you don't, they're not, neither are bad, they're both purposeful, right, in terms of that. And by fully feeling it, we move those negative emotions out. But the way I like to understand emotions is positive emotions are our default. Joy's our default. That's where we should live, in that present moment of, and that's what creates the wonderful things in our lives. Negative emotions are, what do I need to pay attention to? Why is this here? Right? And so it's a matter of like, it's a pay attention sort of thing, and you move through them rather than avoiding it. So they're both a move through, right? But they both have different purposes in terms of that. But we should never stay sad, right? But when the sadness comes, you ride it, you allow it to be. Does that make sense in terms of that? But some people will stay sad
yeah, yeah,
because
yeah,
they
yeah.
run with it, and that's depression. And that's. And then some people will be like, well, I'm going to be great, and everything's fine. And their whole world is totally toxic. So it's a matter of neither of those are authentic states, right?
Mm,
And that's a
complete.
different way of living.
Yeah, and to me, the way I like to sort of think about the more negative, negative emotions, so sadness, feeling low, is
Mhm.
almost like and I don't know whether that's what you were alluding to or not, but for me, I've always sort of thought, well, it's through the adversity that I've grown and developed and
Yeah.
changed. I think about giving birth to my two children, and
Mhm.
I always think it was really painful and hard, but look at the beautiful two beings that came
Right.
out of that. And so as a mum, it really helps me because I just think, well, sometimes that the pain or what feels really like hard,
Yeah.
there's real growth in that, right? So like and also it can be an invitation or almost like an alarm bell, right?
Yeah.
That bringing your attention to, hello, look here, right? As
Right.
an invitation to be, like you were saying, to be present to what is rather than numbing or distracting ourselves. Because with those beauties, it's so easy to distract ourselves. Listeners, I'm pointing to my phone. You won't be seeing that because we'll be audio, but um, we live in a world that is so easy to distract ourselves too, isn't it?
Right.
Um, I mean, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think, for women that have given birth, it's easy to see the parallel too, but it's really like that's a physical manifestation of the process, of the same process, right? Of moving through it. So do you constantly stay in childbirth? No. But it's this forced moving through, right? Epidurals aside and all of that, but like just staying in the natural form of it, right? Like it's a that's an example of exactly that. And at the end, as you move through it, because of what you've moved through and you've lived through it, and then there's something new that's birthed from that,
Mm,
right? And then you leave it behind. It's because it's done, right? And that's so if you can envision that process for every negative emotion that comes in your life of moving through a birth, right? Of full, feeling that within your body. And then at the end, there's something new, right? So you're a mother, right? You're simply on a different journey, after that. So when you think about the difficult things that come in your life, if you can think of each one as a birth as something purposeful, it's so much more enriching, right? And that the option isn't ever to avoid, right? And if you consistently move through life in that way, addictions and pathologies can't exist within that way of being. They just can't. There's nowhere for them to live, right? Because they live in avoidance.
mm,
They live in the past and they live in the future and they live in avoidance. So if you're consistently in the present moment moving through, then those you don't give those um, things capability to exist in your life.
so beautiful.
And that's the journey. Like that's life, right?
So
Yeah.
beautiful. Yes, yes, completely. And you said also it's about living. So one thing that I really love to use for me in my journey into this life as Fabienne is I keep going back um to the infinity sign and the whole idea of, living to love and loving to live.
Mhm.
And I've always been really good at living to love. I'm a real lover of people and plants and like the earth and not so great at loving to live. So for me, the at times the physicality and the materiality of things I found quite challenging as a human. And I'm slowly learning to to enjoy life in and its physicality more. Um, but I wonder also whether that fits in with this whole, we have a physical body, and when, when it hurts, right? There's that
Mhm.
fear of, and the link to death in that, right? It's like the annihilation, the worry that I'm not going to be here anymore. Um, and then the parallel with the that presence and, like that observer and the spiritual and the soul, right?
Mhm.
Um, so there's that. And also like how the scientific, like the positivist and like the courtesy of the Enlightenment years and the country I come from, France, like Descartes, I think, therefore I am. So like
Mhm.
the whole reductionism and the object, and you can, these bodies, all that matters, and the materiality. Um, so I'm sorry, I've given you quite a lot, but I don't know
Mhm.
what comes up, and or what you feel inspired to share in that.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of there's a lot, like in terms of death, right? Is that we're uncomfortable with death because we avoid it. In other cultures and other times, death was a part of the conversation, right? So when you think about that in terms of, the anxiety of death, right? That we will someday not exist, right? It brings up anxiety, right? And that can be a benefit, right? You can be purposeful. People have death experiences, they go through cancer, they go through these things and they appreciate life more. You see that as well. But you'll see people that have actually gone through those processes through illness or accidents, whatever has happened in our current state where we avoid it, they simply come out the other end with a different way of looking at their life, right? And so if we incorporated that, that's also an avoidance, right? This is such a great example of it. It's like we we fear it because we continuously push it away from our conscious thought, right? We don't think about it. Like funerals are very sterile sorts of, right, things of the embalming, and then we put the makeup on, and it's like, let's let's have a process for our grief, but let's keep death out of it, right? Let's kind of, when you think about, we try to kind of sterilize that as much as possible within our modern
I
world.
think get away from kids as well and children, right? We don't need
Yes,
children and young people in any of those conversations at all, right?
right. Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's a matter of like that's also it's a great example of just like how anxiety and depression can breed, by avoiding, right? So there's that's also part of our process that we can welcome in, that eventually like we will all cease to exist in this physical body, right? So and the energy and all of that comes after. I guess suppose it's a separate conversation, but and then in terms of, right, the infinity of like of living to love and loving to live. So like, I'm okay with this side, but then the other side I have a problem with. And so that's your journey, right? Of coming to balance with that. So health, we're talking about like what is health? We have like a lot of, or what is mental health, right? We'll stick to that. It's a matter of balance. That's all it is, So it's not feeling good or feeling bad, right? Because you can feel good or bad and still be imbalanced. So I do for others. I love to take care of plants and kids, and then you can deplete yourself because you're imbalanced, right? And so it's a matter of like always being in the middle of that. So if you're in your present moment, if something really difficult, somebody dies that you love, or you're experiencing a trauma or moving through something, it's a matter of staying within that balance of being able to hold like the palpability of something, the sadness of something, the anger of something, and move through it, and then whenever you come out birthing that right on the other side of moving through and riding that wave, you're in the middle. You're balanced. So it's that you can accept the weight of something. That's the negative end, right? But you're not running with it. And then you can also have peace and be with. And that's sort of that positive side, but not avoid in terms of like everything's fine. Let's not talk about that, right? So like everything is balance. So like
Mm.
within your journey of loving or living to love, you'll have to ask yourself, is that out of balance, right? And so how can I come to balance where I'm also, you know, serving myself, right? In life, right? That this is good, that this is where I need to be. And that you always want to be right in the middle. That's what we're always striving for. And if something's um doesn't feel good, it's just that it's out of balance. And so it's always bringing it back to how can I get that to balance? Where am I on this continuum? How is this out of whack?
Mm. Mm. And as you say, so as you're talking about like being in the middle, it makes me think of like Buddha's middle path, like middle way, right?
Yeah.
But also like the heart, right? So if we think about in our bodies, halfway between like holding the
Mm-hmm.
and linked to yoga, I guess, like the
Yeah,
first
your heart chakra in the
the
middle,
heart
right?
chakra, and then
Mm-hmm.
the first three at the top, and the second, the sort of last three at the bottom, right?
Yeah. 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 So your heart's in the middle, right? Between your higher self and your lower self. So the lower self's like, you're more like physical, right? So yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. So that's where you want it, it's that balance, right? So like your body, the things that you experience viscerally, right? And also your higher self, those all coexist. And so if you can stay in the middle of that, right? And so like in terms of you're looking, through the chakra system, people will get stuck, you know, down maybe in the, a lot of men that I work with are stuck in the lower chakras, right? In terms of pornography and sexual addiction and all of that. And it's the matter of like releasing that, and so that the flow can happen, all the way through. And the heart is the center of that. It's the communicator, like the holder between the higher and the lower selves, So yeah, just imagine then if you're always then you're getting to a place where you're flowing. So I actually just posted, I have a circle app for clients that I work with, and I posted a meditation from Joe Dispenza's work that I adopted. But in his book, Becoming Supernatural, he has a great discussion about blessing of the chakra meditation. And there's a woman that does it really well on YouTube. But it's a matter of like getting all of those things in balance, right? So like meditating on each one. So again, comes down to balance, comes
Mhm.
down to being aligned, right? So if you think about that, being aligned uh with positive affirmations, right? So you're balanced, you're in the present moment, yet you know where you're going positively. And then the actions within your present moment, do they align with where you're going, right? So I'm going to be a millionaire, right? Let's just keep it concrete. That's easy to think about. Okay. Well, the way that I'm thinking about money or the couponing that I'm doing, does that align right with where I'm going, right? So those sorts of things, and of course there's deeper matters, but that's sort of like a very concrete example of that. So it's always you're moving towards the future within that positive, but you're always balanced and it's always aligned. So all of those things, like all of those systems, work together, so it's a matter of like when working with clients, you bring them a little bit at a time, you know what I mean? So because it sounds until you're in it and then it all makes sense. But that's the thing too, like going back to like phenomenology of because it's such a personal sort of process of moving through, because you're that research tool, right? It's like you get it when you're done. You know, like when you've actually done it, like when you've lived it, when you've researched it, when you've analyzed it, when you've put your methodology together, whenever you've moved through it as that research tool, right, that you are, then it makes sense. But if someone tells you before you've done it and you haven't experienced it, it doesn't
Yeah.
fit. So it's a very much an experience. It's a journey,
Yeah.
like that's a journey. It's not
Yeah.
like quantitative where it's like you do this, this, and this, and then you run the stats.
Yeah.
It's very much like you're very much through that process of like within that horizon. And that's life too, if you're doing it well, right?
Mm.
Balanced is you
Yeah.
just allow yourself to experience it. And in that time when it comes, it comes. The anxiety is like, what about this? What do I do? What if it happens? What if this happens and that happens, right? And that's living in that future sort of state that you don't understand and you haven't arrived at.
Mm. And so in a way, what I'm hearing you talk about is what I call flow forming into being and becoming. So
Yes.
like literally, um, after this conversation, I'm not going to be the same person because we've had this conversation and they'll be the same for our listeners, right? Like, um, and it'll be up to everyone to flow form into being and becoming in their own way. Like we can't force anybody to do that, right? Like everybody
Hmm.
is is being and becoming on because of their own journey,
Yeah.
effectively.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so one thing that really interests me is what you mentioned, which is, for example, your male clients, like the people, female, but because you work, a lot with male clients who are, we said, sort of like stuck more in the physicality and
Hmm.
your your physical needs, so like the pornography, all of those things, right? But
Hmm.
I think there's also in many people because of the maybe sometimes the friction with like religion and the
Hmm.
religion and spirituality. I think there's I find that really fascinating. You also mentioned like energy and how people um really don't want to go near spirituality in any way, shape, or form. Um, and yet for me, well, to be balanced, we effectively we have this, like you said, this body is a vessel for this journey. One day,
Hmm.
this vessel
Yeah.
to go back home, right? One last time. That's how I view it. It's like,
Yeah.
um, but of course, loads of people find what I like when I say that, they go, I don't get it, I don't understand. Um, And so it's almost like for them the third, like the head and the cognition is
Hmm.
used solely for the benefit of the vessel, of the
Hmm.
thinking and possibly ruminating and all of those things. Um, so what would be your advice, or what would you say to people who have a real issue with like spiritualities, like to God, not interested in God? Um, I mean, I'm also talking as a recovering Catholic.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
depart from this religion and go, not my religion, doesn't work for me. I don't
Yeah.
really want your innate guilt that you're trying to give me from birth. Can't
Hmm.
relate with that, so you can have it back. Um, so anyway, sorry, I've given you loads, but I don't know whether
No, no, it's there's so religion obviously, spirituality and religion are different, so religion can be an avenue towards spirituality or the other way around, really. Spirituality can move to religion. But religion is what takes something abstract that's in spirituality, this journey, right, that you talk about, like it's experiential sorts of thing. And a lot of that, it lives in the abstract and also in the unseen, right? You move through that. And religion makes that concrete, right? So, talk about Catholicism, right? So in terms of Jesus talking in parables, right? Those are concrete sort of things, talk about um seeds that fall on the soil that aren't sown, as they fall on rocky soil, and, seeds that are in good soil, right? You talk about that parable. So, Jesus wasn't in that story, wasn't talking about soil, right? So it's a matter of like you take the concrete, but the understanding is abstract, in terms of, right? That's why like those stories and parables, he operated within the abstract, right? And so what happened with those stories, right, of Christ, since we're staying in the Catholic realm, is it's like, let's take this and make it concrete. So within the Catholic religion, right, is there's certain things that you do, prayers that you say, right? And then if you do those concrete things, then this, right? And that makes us feel very safe, right? In some sense, right? But then because it's really uncomfortable, it can be, and scary to live in the abstract because it's just you, right? You're making sense of the world inside and the world outside. And so religion can be an avenue towards spirituality, but hopefully people can grow out of the concrete into the abstract. That's where, the message of the parable, that's the good stuff, not the story, right? And does that make sense? So it's like kind of like in raising children, right? Like they live in the concrete, but eventually you hope that they move into more abstract ideas of their journey, right? Like, so there's levels, right? So they can work hand in hand, but I think that to stay within the concrete, in my opinion, and my journey is limiting, right? You have to move beyond that. And those stories and parables and all of that can still support like those concepts, but to really like move through this life, it's not these tangible things of like, as long as I say this prayer, I'll be okay. It doesn't do it. That it's not enough. That's not the journey. And so do you need to be religious to be spiritual? No. I mean, we all know that, right? That's an avenue that people take, right? But it's that higher, coming to that higher self of us all being connected, and that there's something beyond us and that we're all connected to, right? So within Catholicism, Christianity, it's made in God's image, right? Like, what does that mean, right? But abstractly makes sense. It's that we're all connected, that we're all part of this higher, thing, right? This higher essence. And that's already proven in science, like on that quantum
Yeah,
level
on
too, right? You know what I
quantum,
mean?
yeah, I was
So
gonna
it's
say quantum physics, right?
right. There's no argument
Yeah.
argument of that. And so sometimes it's just a matter of people kind of getting there, right? In terms of that. And there's different avenues of getting there. So yeah, like I think it can't anything can really be toxic. And I've worked with people too that have gone really like a very big spiritual realm, have gotten addicted to spirituality. It's like, well, and they all these concepts and grand concepts, like you just don't get it, and they're avoiding through anything works and this is whatever. And so it's a matter of I'm using my journey and my subjective state, but not to grow and move through, but to avoid, right? Like they just don't get me. So it doesn't, none of it has to be bad or good. It's just a matter of how we're utilizing it in terms of, balance, and we all come through it in different ways. But that's always what you want to ask yourself is, are you using this to avoid what's in front of you? Do you keep having the same pattern over and over again? If you are, then you are avoiding, right? So long answer to maybe your long question as well, but it's been a good conversation. But but as far as avoiding spirituality in that journey, which is the spiritual journey, to move through that, I don't think that you can. To, that's been my experience, but it can look differently for everyone. But at the core level, it's the same. It's present moment, it's moving through, it's connecting mind, body, and spirit. That's the same for all of us because we're all coming from the same place, right? We're all connected. So we all have the same experience, the core experience of being human. That's why we're here.
Mm.
All right.
So yeah, completely. Yeah. I still relate to that absolutely. And like some people, like for me, more and more, I just look at the cosmos and the stars and where we come from, right? And like obviously
Mm-hmm.
there's quantum physics, but if you think about how when a star, you know, explode or implode, there's like this sort of like black hole that's created, right?
Right.
And and then it makes complete sense in terms of like who we are, right? Um, in for me, it just makes so much sense in that in terms of, and therefore there's two things when the earlier on when you were talking, I was reminded when you were talking about the middle way, like we were talking sort of it reminded me of Viktor Frankl's sort of
Man's search for meaning.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
between that, like there's this space, and between the stimulus and the response is this space. And it's in that space that you have your freedom and growth is, right?
Right.
Like,
Right.
um, and so going back to that space, it's like, well, if we are all like spatial, sort of like coming from this black hole, like from the stars, right? And stardust, then the choice is, do I agitate or not, right? In terms of, so recently I had this realization that very often when it feels like there's a storm raging, I then sort of thought, oh, but Fabienne, you're just agitating. Like those snow globe. That's what I was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, you're agitating. And you're wondering why there's a storm raging out. Just stop agitating, love. Um, and you'll notice that actually, and then I go back to Frankl and how he wrote his book,
Mm-hmm.
obviously after being freed from concentration camps and, you know, being kept alive because he wanted to share that book that was taken away, right?
Yeah.
And I think about him in particular, and I go, well, who am I to complain given the utter position of privilege I live in, right? Like it just puts this, he's got this beauty of putting things into perspective also,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of how challenging my life sometimes I feel or think it is.
Mm-hmm.
Does that also make
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also like a testament to like how we enrich one another, right? And allowing, in understanding one another's stories and journeys rather than coming from like, this is my understanding and these people are weird or these people just don't get it or these people, right? Like in allowing like a space to like really get others, then that enriches your journey, right? It's like you really we find our purpose in others, right? Whether it's perspective of wow, Frankel's journey and what he's what he's gone through and what he's created out of it and all of that, and gives you perspective. It can give somebody else encouragement, it can give somebody else peace, it can give someone else a feeling of not of being connected with someone when they feel alone. Like we do that for one another. So that's the thing too. I wrote a book on the Socratic method of counseling, but the core of Socratic counseling, the core of Socratic philosophy is that there's this innate knowledge, right? Like that it's inborn, and that it's a matter of the Socratic dialogue, right? That we know so well of asking questions is moving that out. The inborn knowledge is that I know that I don't know, right? But it's in there. And so it's through questioning that you're able to get it out. But how do you do that? You do that through others, right? So like it's that we need one another in order to elevate. And keep moving and encourage. And, so that's another beautiful way in terms of like how we're connected in this world, right? Like through these vessels, if we allow it, right? If
Mm.
we don't close ourselves off, right? In terms of that. And it doesn't mean everyone has your best intentions at heart, right? But that's also that personal responsibility and moving through and knowing yourself, right? Like all of that works hand in hand. So it's not a matter of blind trust, but it's a matter of like clarity and connection and all of that has to be experienced. Someone can say that and be like, I don't know what you're talking about till you're there.
Yeah. And this staircase you were talking about,
Mm-hmm.
it's like it's part of the ongoing journey, right? Like
Yes.
it's just ongoing, and you can just like it.
Yeah, you're leveling up each time. So sometimes
Yeah.
like, I work with men and it's like, oh gosh, like I had a hard time and then I just did something really stupid and it's like, is this experience this time different than the last time? Well, yeah, it is. Like I was able to think about it and I was able to do this and A, B, and C. Well, then you're on a different part of the spiral staircase, even though the challenge that you've gone through feels the same, like you're chasing your tail, you're not because it's different. And then eventually as you move up that spiral staircase, the challenges are different. They just you've moved on to other things. So as long as you don't stay on the level one, but even though it feels familiar when you make that roundabout so that you're at a different level, right? And that's
Yeah.
if you can think of your life as a spiral staircase in that way, if each time that you experience a familiar something that you don't love, have you leveled up though? And now how are you moving through it, right?
And I guess it's like that dissociative state you were talking about at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Where when people are truly in trauma and feel stuck and they can't move through, etc. I often sort of say, I've got friends and family, who have gone through really deep sort of periods of depression. Um, and watching that sort of when you're really in the middle of a depressive sort of like depression, it feels like you're just completely stuck and functioning is really, really hard. But I often sort of say, well, actually, sometimes it feels like even though you're moving to starting, rather than being completely dissociated and not feeling and not being able to even get up and have a shower, that level up from that, even if it's just one rung of stairs, it still feels so familiar,
Mm-hmm.
but you're moving up, right? And it's all
Right.
like being invited to realize that feeling, even if it's sadness or anger or, starting to feel your emotions rather than numbness,
Right.
is a way up, right? Um, And I don't think that's often discussed enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I don't know whether that.
Yeah. It's like the paradox of like in letting go of control, you gain it, right? So it's like I want to control this. I don't want to feel bad. I want to, so you go into anxiety or depression, right? But it's a matter of like pushing things away. And so when you allow it to be and move through, then it gets to move out, right? And in that, like, I'm going to let go of the need to control this and manage it. That's how you gain that control and stability, right? It's like your subconscious is like, oh, you can live through this, right? Like and then it no longer the depression or anxiety or whatever's happening to you to keep what your subconscious think is safe no longer serves, right? But a lot of times, in terms of depression is like, why is this here? Like depression's a lot of times, a symptom of an unfulfilled life or meaninglessness or unhappiness, or, a lot of times you probably know the reasons you are, but sometimes you don't, sometimes you don't. And it's like being able to listen to that as well of, what the sadness is telling you, right? Or what the anxiety is telling you, because it's there.
Mm. And in that, there's the word you use several, like a couple of times at least, which is that authenticity.
Yeah.
Um, and I really, really feel like now I've decided I don't really care how I'm received, and I'm just gonna show up as me and like unapologetically myself.
Yeah.
That's been so freeing in terms of, this whole idea of, oh, but if I worry how I'm going to be received by others, or if I dim down or, play down parts or, whatever, or hide things, or, I
Yeah.
think there's so many of us who sort of go around life either um, armored up, like protected, or masking, or, um, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I just feel
Mhm.
like if we were all, and that leads to one thing that emerged when you were talking earlier on that I didn't mention, is like you were sort of talking about how the children are very much when you're born, from coming out. I often joke because I think we probably come out of our mother's womb and go, that's why we scream, because like, no, like I'm back, authenticity, great.
Yeah.
That's probably why we cry, right? And
Hmm.
then you remember what it feels like to be in this body. And so, like, your childhood is moving from this, like re-entering a body and into your physicality. And a lot of my research is around the really pivotal age of teenagehood.
Hmm.
Um, and how I feel, I'll talk about England because that's what I know the most. I think we're not allowing our teenagers to really root themselves in their physicality and to then really find their sort of like, so to go through healthily the, oh, this is who I am as a unique ecosystem as you grow into your childhood. And then like from your heart to then find your voice and start voicing like my truth and who I am. Um, and so, of course, like in England, they have to wear uniforms. We have really draconian approaches to, how they show up in school. You have to be obedient, like, all of those things. Um, and I wonder how much that impacts that journey up the staircase, right? And how often then teenagers will find ways to control when they don't feel they can control, right? So that can be the pornography or looking at pornography because that's one thing for girls self-harming, for example, right? Is that also would you say that's your observation?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, most of I would say like 95% of the patterns that people have in their present life are from childhood, from when they were 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, through those traumas. And that's really like, so when you think about in terms of childhood, your your brain states. So from, 0 to 1, you're at the delta stage, or it's basically like the dreamlike stage, right? And then from what, like 1 to 7, you're in the theta stage, or second of like a hypnotic stage. So your mind accepts anything, right? Hypnosis, right? That is.
That's
And
why
then,
the Mormons say, give me a boy and I'll give you, no, give me a boy till he's 7 and I'll give you the man or something like that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, the subconscious is open, accepts anything. And then in the teenage years, as they're moving through adolescence into the young teenage years, they're in the alpha state, which is kind of like between sleeping and waking, right? So you're very susceptible to suggestion, right? And you can see that in teenagers, right? So they're and
Yeah.
as they're moving more then into adulthood, as they're moving into, well, adolescence and adulthood, the beta stage is where we operate like full conscious, right? Like awareness. And so when you thinking about it in terms of the where you are in terms of brain development, the other question that you had is like, would you find that most of the things, like from that makes an impact? It's like that's most of it is when you're young and into the teenagers. And so, going to school and the expectations, don't talk, you need to be perfect, go to your room, only, like all of these things people will repeat in their adulthood. And 95%, if not even more, is from those years. They just do the same things over and over and over and over again. So one common question that I ask, and they're like, oh, I keep, my wife and I are we're just having such a hard time. And I just like every time, and it's like, she just makes me feel like this or whatever. It's like, when have you felt like that before? And it always goes back to, well, when my dad or when my mom or when I was in, school. It always moves back to that because it's that we learn to dissociate. So by the time that we're adults, into that beta stage, there's so much programming that has happened and that we've accepted. And a lot of that is, following the rules and this is what's good, this is what's bad. And so we don't learn, right, like critical thinking and learning to be in our bodies and any of that. So of course we create these, just move through these patterns over, and then the same thing happens. We get the same relationships over and over again. We have the same problems over and over again. We get fired from the job, right? It's like, why does this keep happening to me? And it's because of the things that we've been taught and accepted through our environment. And all of those things matter, right? All of those things contribute to the beings that we are today. And so it's in awareness and clarity and that spiritual journey that only through that are we able to change our lives, to intentionally create them rather than unintentionally create them, which is what we've been doing prior to waking up, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
Amazing. Is there a question I haven't asked you that you wish I'd asked you in this wonderful meandering and
I know it's been a good no, I don't think so. I think probably usually what's asked at the end is kind of like final thoughts. I think the only thing that I was thinking of a final thought as you were talking about like authenticity, people are like, well, clients will ask like what does that even mean, right? Because that's a journey, authentic. But in terms of being authentic is, are you the same at work, at school, at home? And I don't mean, there's roles that we play, right? Like I need to put on a suit and I need to be more professional, have more boundaries when I'm in this executive role as opposed to playing with my children. But is your essence, are you the same person? Will people recognize you at the park that know you in the office, that know you in your marriage, that know you on vacation? And if the answer is they would recognize that person, it's the same person. And you would be surprised at particularly men that I work with too, because they're in these spaces, right? This sexual space, this marriage space, this church space. I actually started my journey with evangelical men that are sexual addicts. Those are so different that they dissociate, they have split personalities. I call them mild splits, but they are unrecognizable, right? And so a lot of people will be maybe not unrecognizable, but not the same, not really the same. And so if I'm different, notably different in each space, then I'm not living authentically. And that's how we move toward is taking all of our personalities and creating one cohesive integration, right? So there's like the three faces of Eve on one spectrum where there's dissociative identity disorder, but we do that in mild ways. And so the journey is integrating all of us into one. And then that's when we've reached authenticity. We're one being in all the spaces. We're the same.
like
Yeah.
one essence, I guess.
One essence, right? Yeah. Yeah. Everyone can come to the party and they would all recognize and I would be comfortable, right? Office workers and my partner and my kids and
Mm.
if everybody was in the same space, I'd be okay.
Yeah.
Not everyone can say that.
No, 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 no. Yeah, completely. Wow. Amazing. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Absolutely. Great conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. So if you one last thought before we stop recording, is there anything you're taking away and or leaving us with?
Well, I guess that would be the big thing is, asking yourself, am I authentic? Am I in balance? Can you answer those things for yourself? I would leave you with that, you know, and that you never arrive, right? Like this is there is no. I guess I would leave with that maybe now that I'm speaking is there is no arrival. We just keep leveling up, right? So it's not a I can't wait till this is past me. It's you just we just keep going, you know? So there
The,
there isn't
the,
there isn't
sta-
anywhere to arrive at.
the stairwell is like the spiral
That's right.
staircase is to
Yeah.
infinity and beyond.
Yeah, you never get there and you've made it to the finish line, It's the whole journey's all of life, So hopefully with each step and each year it gets better and better and, with more depth. And better, I don't always mean pleasant, but better. That's the journey, right?
Amazing.
Yeah,
Thank, thank you.
absolutely.